Up next, we have Sean Watts from the Seattle Parks Foundation. Sean has worked now for 2 decades at the intersection of science, policy, and society to incorporate community engagement and public benefit into environmental solutions. He is currently Director of Community Partnerships at Seattle Parks Foundation, where he acts as a policy liaison and advocate for resident-led groups enhancing open space across Seattle. Throughout his career as faculty at Santa Clara University, AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation, and as a director of the UW Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Program, he has sought to lower barriers for communities to influence in the science and the policy that affects them. Please join me in welcoming Sean.
Thank you, John. Thanks for coming out, everybody. It's great to see this mix of presentations. And I thought I would focus on, we're talking about in the big picture getting broad engagement in stewardship, and if we step back from stewardship as a goal, that a prerequisite to that is kind of the buy-in among the folks who would be doing the stewardship and the kind of community engagement involved there. And I'd like to talk about the trust part of that, which is a prerequisite to buy-in, kind of the trust between residents that are being engaged in a lot of this process. So, but I'll first start by just kind of giving an overview of how the Seattle Parks Foundation works and what we do, and the kind of scales of work we do, and then use a couple examples from 2 communities to contrast the Georgetown and South Park, Duwamish Valley area and the Little Brook area, and how we've approached trying to build that trust leading to buy-in, and then ultimately the stewardship and this kind of community-driven work that we do. So we work with community groups to enhance and create parks and open space in their own vision. And we have kind of core criteria for these strong partnerships that we try to develop with the people we work with. All of these projects work to increase connections and access to open spaces. We require the shared, inclusive resident leadership. We don't work with partners who haven't done the kind of footwork and groundwork and laid down a good, strong, broad, diverse base of residents to partner with. And I think the first 2 bullets there are kind of, again, prerequisites to these durable public and private partnerships that we try to set up and for the community members we work with, and between them and the agencies that we are always working with on public space. So we work at kind of 3 scales of work. We have the community level, where any individual community group might need fiscal sponsorship in order to seek funding, and we help them often to do this kind of policy advocacy work that's required to get, say, an individual lot improved or a playground in their park. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we work on these kind of large projects that require major political or financial capital in order to get them pushed through. The picture there is one of these, the lake to bay connection between the Central Waterfront and South Lake Union, going by the Seattle Center. And so those require kind of coalition building at a grand scale. But in the middle, we work at these kind of connected public space level, as we call it, this multi-neighborhood planning, prioritization, and implementation that might take a year of working really closely with the community to look at their entire neighborhood and all the opportunities. I'll come back to that, but I wanted to give just a real primer on how we got started. So we emerged somewhat from the Seattle Commons efforts, and I kind of like the contrast between these 2. If you want to orient yourself, you can see the red square next to what would have been the Seattle Commons, Denny Park, and then that red square in the other image is where Denny Park is. And can you imagine the Central Park Commons that Seattle Commons could have been? And at the same time that this effort was happening in the late 90s, one of our founding board members, Ken Bounds, was the superintendent and had done commissioned a study of these different parks foundations across the nation, because they realized that there needs to be this kind of convening and coalition building a group to do this work. So that always sticks in my head when I'm walking in that area or driving by Mercer or trying to get across town there. So coming back to these kind of three scales of work, the connected public space system is the one I'd want to focus on today because it's the one I think that demonstrates this need to build buy-in, to think about the motivations of the individual residents in the communities we work in. And I'm focusing here particularly on underserved communities because I think buy-in for things like tree canopy and maintenance are easier in places that are well off or more well off. So working at this scale, multi-neighborhood, it presents a lot of challenges, but I think a lot more advantages. And the challenges, to take those first, they're often in these areas numerous neglected spaces to have to address. So it can be daunting just to kind of get a list, to work with community members to create a list of things, of opportunities, and to seek solutions there. In these areas, there are often low barriers to developers to come in, buy land on the cheap, and to develop it, and high barriers to communities' influence on that process. So residents have lots of barriers to political access, including language barriers or just time. And so that is that next bullet there, this limited human capital. Often these folks are dealing with child care and senior care and cobbling together incomes to just make it through the day, and to then layer on top of that the time it takes to engage in a volunteer process to talk about community planning is just over and above. Often they're lacking in the kind of networks and expertise that come when you are in a better off community. Some of the community groups, and we work with anyone across the city who needs kind of fiscal sponsorship, but it's interesting to contrast, say, the steering committee that might be involved in one neighborhood where it might be composed of former board members and superintendents of this and that, and they've got the experience and expertise to really shepherd this effort. And so that last bullet of the challenge is a trust deficit. These are, I can't remember who said this in a meeting the other day, but these are overplanned and overpromised and underdelivered areas, and overplanned and underdelivered areas. There are often plans that are created by outside groups coming in, taking a lot of community time to put input into plans that then don't ever actually come to, they're kind of handed over like, here you go, good luck with that, and then folks disappear. And there is such a trust deficit for working at this scale in communities that you have to really pay attention on the front end to how you take advantage of that, the opportunity to do that. So some of the advantages, though, if you can get through that, are the community prioritization centers on the community's own needs because they're able to express them. At the scale of multi-neighborhoods, you're explicitly talking about connections and access, and this is how some of the urban forest will be recovered is by these connections, these little right-of-way links between existing park space. When you have a lot of these sites, then you automatically have an opportunity to compromise between what you might use one site for versus another. And then you get this community ownership and buy-in and sense of place when folks are actually looking at all of these opportunities and working on that together to come to a consensus about the best priority order of working on them. And I think this depth of engagement, the kind of demonstrated community engagement and work on that scale attracts both public and private funding because it has this kind of demonstrated commitment. So to take kind of two different areas of Seattle, the lower Duwamish on the left, Georgetown on the north side of the Duwamish River, and South Park on the south side, and then Little Brook in the hub urban village area and north of there in Lake City. So 145th runs across the top there, and then 125th is the street on the bottom. So we're kind of looking at that core right around Lake City Way. And I like to contrast these two because they really get at the challenges we face in bringing improvements, environmental and social and economic to these areas. So just kind of a brief overview of our work there. There are huge health challenges that the folks in the Lower Duwamish face. This is an area that where the longevity is 8 years less than the King County average. There, it has some of the lowest tree canopy in the city. I think the average is 23% now, and we're talking 12 and 6% in some cases, I believe. Folks have 47% higher rates of heart disease than the county average. Childhood asthma, hospitalization for asthma rates are at astronomical rates. So these communities already bear the brunt of the kind of industrial work that's going on there, the lack of green space, lack of access to recreational opportunities. And so they're important from a number of those multiple benefits. But just look at the timeline of our investment. We started working there in 2009 and worked on a green space plan with a resident committee that was published in 2014. We had been laying a groundwork in Georgetown and started a plan there in 2015 and just released it in January of this year. And through that prioritization, we continue to stay on then and help the community to implement what they've already designated as their kind of priority open space projects. Since 2009, we've either fundraised or directly invested $1 million or more. And especially if you include the staffing, that we have a staff, a Duwamish Valley program manager who helps to kind of convene and keep up momentum on a lot of this stuff. And we're directly supporting the community-based organizations as opposed to, say, siphoning off funding that might go to help them do their work. We lift them up and try to direct funding so that they can do what they already know are the priorities for the community even better. And we're now coordinating with the City of Seattle's Duwamish Valley Action Team, with Michelle Caulfield and her colleagues to try to push some of these priorities forward. Contrast that situation with Little Brook. This is another diverse, lower income, high language barriers, high immigrant population. In this case, the water body is the Little Brook, which bisects the neighborhood, and you can see it in the blue line there. What you see in the green are kind of open space opportunities we've identified that we would like to bring to the community. This is a salmon-bearing watershed, the Thornton Creek watershed, and the North and South Fork of Thornton Creek are actually doing fairly well, but Little Brook is a major contributor to low water quality from stormwater runoff. Fecal coliform levels are high when it passes through parks that lack bathrooms, for example. And Lake City Way itself then cuts through the center of this neighborhood and contributes to negative water quality and pedestrian safety. And one thing I like to point out about Little Brook is because it's on the north end, it was annexed, and there's a lack of sidewalks, and there is some confusion about jurisdiction over culverts and control of right-of-way. I kind of see it as crisis as opportunity. Here's an opportunity to go in and replace, instead of what would usually be compromised retrofits on existing gray infrastructure, we can go in and actually do green infrastructure de novo and in a way that has kind of layers in all of these multiple benefits. But the big challenge here is that this is an even more kind of balkanized community. There are lots of individual apartment buildings, lots of different ethnicities that have language barriers, and fewer of these kind of cohesive community-based organizations. So we had to kind of develop a strategy for simultaneously trying to address the challenge of holding on to open spaces in the face of rapid development, continuing outreach to build a resident-led steering committee, and working with youth, which are often, in the case of these teen service learning programs, often they are the only English speakers in their families, and so we see that as an opportunity for engagement. So just to kind of put a fine point on the contrast between these two, in the Duwamish Valley, we have a very active, dedicated, organized residents. There are many community-based organizations. In South Park alone, there's 6. In Georgetown, there are 5. Contrasting that with Little Brook, wide ethnic range, wider than I would say in the Duwamish Valley neighborhoods we work in. High language barriers, often a lot of recent transplants, and so there's a lack of that cohesive historic resident base that we took it, like we benefited from in South Park in particular. There are lots of outside of the Lake City core groups. There's the Lake City Neighborhood Alliance, does great work, Thornton Creek Alliance. They all do great work, but very few that are of and by Little Brook residents. So it ends up being folks from well-meaning from the outside of that core trying to improve on behalf of folks in the core. I think in the Duwamish Valley, you have this unified and driving open space motivation of these direct health impacts of industry and their Superfund site kind of running right through the center. You contrast that with Little Brook, where the creek itself is culverted over probably 2/3 of the way, and it's out of sight, out of mind. And so there we had to kind of frame the motivation by thinking about the challenge to the streetscape and challenges to pedestrian safety, increasing connectivity, nicer walks, easier walks to school and to and from different areas of interest for the community. And there's a ton of news and attention and focus of public and private mitigation dollars in the Duwamish Valley, given that Superfund site and these huge health disparities. And there's a lot of public attention in Little Brook focused on the redevelopment and transit issues as well. But again, it's really difficult to be accessing, I think, the folks who really need it most. So I'll be wrapping up then with just how these challenges we face in different communities of getting community engagement and trust, what we've learned are important. One, you show up before you're on the agenda. You don't go in just to say, we would like to get this from you, to learn this about you. I'm always asking who's not in the room when I'm trying to build an inclusive steering committee. And I think credible ambassadors, working with folks who are already the grass shoots, but continuing to do that before you start to move forward with a planning process. One of my favorite quotes from a group that does kind of public relations: most people don't care about most things most of the time. So how do we increase the awareness engagement in issues that most people don't care about most of the time? We try to manage expectations. On the one hand, we don't want to go in and overpromise and underdeliver, but we also, I think it's a job to create an awareness of possibilities. Like I said with Little Brook, when it's out of sight and out of mind, how do you build engagement on that? We're always trying to compensate wherever possible, putting in resident contracts, trying to, if there are barriers to participation of somebody who would otherwise lead a steering committee, we make available stipends so that we're offsetting some of that burden from them. So you must be asking, what does this have to do with flyways? I think birds can be great ambassadors because they're very visible, they're often generalists, therefore they're common, they don't have a lot of the barriers since they're volant. These habitats also that we're trying to preserve, as Mark had eloquently pointed out, have huge, multiple public benefits. But framing, I think, is still paramount in this case. You can't leap to this, isn't this great? You should be a steward of this. I think we have to constantly ask ourselves, what is in it for the residents, particularly those who cannot afford yet another priority in their lives. I've got 9 years of post-high school training, and so this image of the backyard bird habitat is, as an ecologist, super exciting to me. But I think it takes tireless outreach before that and the complexity of understanding it would require becomes something interesting to folks. Not that it's impossible. Another issue here is, what does community benefit then have to do with flyways? Parks are never going to be sufficient. I've gone in this area. This is Northgate Way and Lake City Way are the kind of main roads there, and just circled what I know to be the parks in that area. But most of that tree canopy is going to be provided by, as everybody is aware, private land and right-of-way work. I think that this calls out for an urgent need to kind of realign public and private partnerships. On the private side, I think adjusting the traditional approaches to land trusts in the hinterlands, in exurbs and wildlands, to how that model would need to adapt to work on the more granular open space opportunities in cities is a really a big and open question that we're grappling with. And then on the agency side, I think innovation on green infrastructure and green job pathways, some way of building local jobs that are related to green infrastructure. And I just have a very few ideas on that. I will just quickly run through these. I think this lowering of barriers and increasing incentives, we need to pay folks to get involved in this. I think paid local youth stipends for tree planting and maintenance crews, and connecting that with kind of a cascading or a vertical mentorship where these folks can get involved in these green job pathways, maybe working towards certification. As they prove themselves on, they become managers to folks and inspiring their neighbors and their peers. Adopt a flyway programs, somehow getting donors to recognize these kind of stipends and lowering these barriers are as important as the trees themselves to making this work. Planting and maintenance kits as the tree stewards do. Supporting community land trusts or taking that model and applying that in the city. And figuring out how we do above code development incentives for easements and integrating publicly accessible open space. And I'd be happy to talk more about that, but I know time is up. Just a quick quote. I think by inviting people to the table who have not had access to the decision-making process, we can imagine and create new things together that alone we could never have dreamed of. I think that's what's missing sometimes in this conversation is we don't even know what new perspectives would be gained from really broadening the folks at the table. And I will leave it there. Thank you.